Arlene desperately wanted to shriek at the sight of that, but he couldn't get enough air. He let out a strangled moan and strove to free his left arm. His right was too securely pinned on the Grancer's body. Red and gray fluid was bubbling up where Grancer's left eye should have been. A bright, sharp stink scorched through Arlene's nostrils, making it even harder to draw the deep breath he desperately needed. Arlene's mouth was wide open and he sucked frantically for air. He watched in sickened horror as the thick red fluid oozed on Grancer's cheek. That was not just blood. Blood would have been bad enough to have grandfathers lying atop of him. Perhaps dead, perhaps dying, with blood welling up from his eye socket would have been terrible enough to give Arlene a nightmare for years. But this was not just blood. Human blood did not steam and bubble, and was never so vicious. Arlene knew what had happened. The third dragon had looked into the pantry and seen Grancer there, and Grancer had shouted defiance. The dragon had listened for a moment and grown annoyed. It had been unable to reach into the stone patch with fang or claw, had not wanted to trouble itself with smashing down the stone wall, so it had breathed its fiery venom at Grancer. But the dragon had been so close to the man that the venom would not burn, so close it had not time to ignite. Instead it had struck Grancer full in the face as a toxic spray. Some had burst into flame when it struck the hot ceiling or the back wall of the ladder well, but the liquid that hit Grancer had remained venom, rather than fuel. And if the stories were right, it was eating the flesh from grandfather's bones. Arlene almost hoped Grancer was dead for his sake, but for his own. He hoped the old man still lived and might somehow help them both survive. Survival did not seem very likely for either of them, though. The smoke was growing denser, the roar of the flames louder, and Arlene thought the whole cellar might cave in upon him. And then that thick red trickle moved slowly down Grancer's cheek, and finally dripped down the first fat drop, landing squarely in Arlene's open, gasping mouth. All right, yay, time for Chapter 3, Lord Dragon. The shock of that impact on his parched tongue, the indescribably vile taste, the unbearable stench, the corrosive burning that seemed to be tearing the lining from his mouth and throat. The knowledge of what was happening was more than Arlene could bear. He fainted. He woke choking in the dark, coughing of slime, and his convulsions threw his grandfather's body off him. The ladder that had pinned them both down snapped free and rattled to one side, one rail broken off short. Arlene rolled over and vomited up everything he could bring up, vomited until his chin dripped with stinking ooze. His elbows rested in a widening pool of acidic detritus. His eyes filled with tears, both from the agony in his gut and the awareness of utter disaster, the knowledge that his home and his family had been destroyed. He pulled himself clear, away from the corruption his body had expelled, away from the ladder and Grancer, into relatively cool darkness and sweeter air. There he fainted again. He was awakened again. After how long he did not know. By voices, by laughter. He blinked and lay still, trying to remember where he was. What had happened? He was in the cellars, he remembered. He could see that he was still in the cellars, looking at the bottom shelf of one rack of preserves. Daylight filtered down from above, daylight thick with drifting dust. He was alive. The fire had passed over him, and the cellars had not fallen in. He heard footsteps somewhere above, heavy footsteps that crunched as if walking in the black ash the volcanoes sometimes spewed. Daylight in the cellars, the roof was gone. Arlo remembered the fire, the smoke, the heat. He remembered the dragons. He remembered the third one's face when it peered into the pantry, its eyes huge and alien and knowing. It had been the eyes that frightened him into stepping back and falling, far more than anything else. The fangs, the jaws, the dripping belly, he had hardly noticed those. He had only seen those great dark eyes, bottomless and terrifying. He had fallen, he remembered that now, and his grandfather had fallen. And Grancer had been struck by the dragon's acidic venom. Arlene sat up, moving convulsively. He gulped air, choking and gasping, and turned. Grancer lay beside him on the stone floor, or rather Grancer's corpse lay there. There could be no doubt about it. He was dead. The venom had eaten his flesh away, exposing bone in half a dozen places, from a patch of skull where his forehead should have been, to the protruding parallel curves of bare ribs above the blackened, ruined remains of his chest. Arlene's empty stomach contracted painfully. He had nothing left to bring up. He moaned and blinked as his eyes filled anew with tears. His grandfather was dead. His parents were gone, almost certainly dead. His brother as well. His entire life had been destroyed, suddenly and swiftly, with no warning. At least none beyond the spell of bad weather. Excuse me. Something burned deep within him. Not pain, not an emotion, but a strange sensation he had never felt before. He remembered how he had lain trapped where his grandfather's venom-corrupted body, blood dripped into his mouth. He moaned again, slightly louder. The footsteps overhead stopped. Did you hear something? An unfamiliar voice asked. Not the voice of any villager, Arlene was sure. Arlene could hear another voice respond, but could make out none of the words. He looked up startled and blinked the tears from his eyes. Who was up there? He assumed there were survivors, people he knew, but these voices spoke with an old lilt, an accent unlike anything he ever heard. Even the people who lived in the farms and villages down by the river did not sound like that. The opening at the top of the ladder well was larger than it should have been. Wooden flooring, doors, and ceiling had burned away, and parts of the stone walls had tumbled. Arlen could see hazy blue sky, but not much more than that. From that chimney, maybe, the voice said. Arlen swallowed, trying to think clearly, despite the overwhelming grief and shock that filled his mind. There were strangers in the rooms of his family home. Who were they? What should he do? Two other voices spoke, and the footsteps sounded again, moving closer. A moment later, a man's face appeared over the top of one of the stone walls, looking down at him. It's no chimney, the man shouted. There's a cellar down here, and people, and one of them's alive. Help, Arlene called weakly. Help me. You wait right there, boy, the man said, grinning down. Arlene stared at the man for a moment. That grin didn't look quite right somehow. Then there was a series of thumps and crashes, and someone was leaning over the ruined remains of the pantry floor, looking down at him. It was a man wearing a sleeveless brown leather coat despite the heat. He had an iron pry bar in one hand. His face and coat were smeared with soot, and his hair and beard were black, so the soot didn't show, but they were disheveled. Arlene had never seen him before. Whoever these people were, they definitely weren't from the village. Perhaps despite their odd speech, they were rescuers from the river towns. Arlene had only been down off the mountain 2 or 3 times in his life. Perhaps he didn't know as much about the river folk as he thought. An almost cool edgy of air stirred Arlene's hair, and he wondered how long he had lain unconscious. Judging by that breeze, the long hot spell of the dragon weather had apparently ended at last. That could happen suddenly, but he feared he had slept for days or even weeks and been left for dead by his family. But the dragon weather had passed, and the dragons it had brought were gone. The worst was surely over. What's down there, boy? The stranger asked. Is there anyone but you? Arlene glanced at his grandfather's corpse, then swallowed. Just me, he said. And what else? Is there treasure? Obsidian? Arlene blinked confused. There's cheese, he said, and preserves, and wine. So you wouldn't starve if we left you then. Don't leave me down here, Arlene shrieked. The man frowned. It's not up to me, boy, he said. It's up to Lord Dragon. Arlene's jaw sagged, and he slumped back against the shelves. Lord Dragon? Yes, that's what we call him. What we call him, Arlene relaxed slightly. Then it was a man after all, and not a dragon. For a few seconds there, he had a nightmarish image in his head of one of those black dragons still here in the village, giving these people orders. He had thought that perhaps all the dragons had awakened from their slumbers and come to reclaim the lands of man and restore their ancient empire. But it was just a man. Arlen remembered what his parents had told him, how it was the custom in many places not to use real names in the ancient tongue, but common words, Lord Stick, Lady Flower, or the like. But who would dare call himself Lord Dragon? Just then the man straightened and turned away from Arlen and spoke to someone Arlen could not see. The boy was unable to make out the words, but the voice answering was cold and deep. The 2 men, the one in the pantry and the one peering over the broken wall, both vanished. Arlen called, Hey, where are you? Shut up, boy, said the cold, deep voice. Arlen shut up. If they left him, it wouldn't be all that bad, he told himself. He did have plenty of food and eventually could get the ladder back in the place and climb. Who were these men? What were they doing here? They weren't rescuers of any sort from their behavior. And then 2 men appeared in front of where the pantry had been. The man in the brown leather coat and another in a smoke-stained canvas vest. The one in the vest was carrying a coil of rope. They were stepping carefully. Arlene guessed that the pantry floor was largely burned away and they were wary of falling through. The coil of rope was swung down the cellars, one end still secured somewhere out of sight. The man in the vest grabbed hold of it and lowered himself cautiously down, carefully avoiding stepping over the gory corpse at the foot of the ladder. At the bottom, he stopped and dusted up his pants as he looked around. Okay, gonna stop here. 10 minutes is already almost up again.